Scientists have discovered a new ancient Mayan burial site in Mexico, and there is a big surprise in this. And also, I just want to let you know up front, everything's going to be okay. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. This episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, the surprising thing in the discovery of some 100 bodies, 64 of which they've been able to discern and do some research on. There are a couple surprising elements. One, they've been able to track the DNA to modern descendants, and so they've found that there are these little corpses are related to people who are alive today. They think that they were buried over a period of about 500 years, that they were victims of child sacrifice, that they were between 3 and 6 years old. About half of them were between 3 and 6 years old. And this is all in a new paper by a guy named Rodrigo Barquera, who is with the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. And anyway, but what caught my eye in this story, though, gentlemen, was well down in the story. And see, this is the problem with me. I won't just be satisfied with a headline and the lead and then move on to the next story. I have this annoying habit of reading all the way through the story, and this what gets me. So I'll tell you, the surprising part, first of all, was that despite what anthropologists have believed for years, that most child sacrifice was conducted on girls, these are all males. And so it kind of busts their bubble of thinking that primarily the Mayans were sacrificing girls as some sort of, virgin in the volcano kind of thing. And all of these corpses were male corpses. Some of them were identical twins. But the part that disturbed me, Stephen Green, and I'll read the quote from you. This is from Rodrigo Barquera, who wrote the paper about this. And because I don't have my glasses, I'm going to hold the screen really close to my face. It says this: we have to bear in mind that death is a completely different concept for Mesoamerican cultures. Death is not seen as a bad thing. Of course, under our perspective, it's wrong. But back then, and according to their myths and their beliefs, what they were doing was considered correct. And so, Steve, we cannot judge what they did under our modern point of view. Steve, just in case you missed the beginning of the show, what they did was child sacrifice. What do you think of Mr. Barquera's insight into the fact that we cannot judge at this late date the good that they were intending to do, and that they did what was right in their own eyes?
Oh, yes, we can, and we should, and we must. They might have had a different concept of death, but the result's the same. The process is just as painful and as permanent for these 5 and 6 year olds who were murdered over a period of years. And boy, all I can say is, we always get let me make sure I've got these correct. But the way I learned it was the Aztecs were the mean guys doing all the human sacrifices, and the Mayans were the nice, peaceful guys who would never ever do such a thing, except
making calendars.
It turns out they were doing that kind of thing. Yeah, and well, I assume they did their sacrifices on a very strict schedule, Bill, because they had all that stuff figured out. I'm joking because I have to. It's either that or cry about this kind of thing. It makes you think. All of this talk about evil Western colonialism and all that is really just a very thin disguise for hating the West. Because honestly, I hear stories like that from you, Scott, and I just think Cortez did not kick nearly enough ass. He really should have just done a much more thorough job, and I'm not sure he could have. I'm not actually disappointed in him, but it was primarily the Royal Navy with a big assist from the United States Navy that ended the slave trade. That's not appreciated, and most of that slave trade was Arab on black and black on black in West Africa. And we decided...
And 91% of them went to the Caribbean, by the way, not to the United States.
Yeah, and a couple of Western powers decided that slavery was wrong, and we were gonna kick some booty in places where it needed to be kicked until that kind of thing stopped. There's a famous story from the British Raj in India where the locals were going to burn a widow to death because, her husband died. And the locals explained to the British officer in charge that that was their custom. And the British officer in charge says, well, it's our custom to hang you by the neck until dead if you murder a woman. And so that's what we'll do, just following our customs. So there's a lot to be said for Western imperialism, colonialism, whatever you want to call it, because we impose some pretty damn good values on the rest of the world. And when I look at what's happened, I'm going to get in so much trouble for saying these words, but I've been thinking about this for a long time, ever since colonialism became a dirty word. When you look at what's happened in some parts of the world since decolonialism began in earnest in the 1950s, not only have those parts of the world, some of them anyway, been run much, much worse than before, but you look at this neo-colonialism going on in Europe, Canada, the United States, 35% of children in Austrian elementary schools are Muslim, and they now outnumber Catholics. And it was only a couple of generations ago that Austria was basically 100% Catholic, which means that Austria is just a couple of generations away from being majority Muslim. That's colonialism. And Europe has invited it in out of this guilt that they once imposed good and just Western values on parts of the world that desperately needed them.
Bill Whittle, I don't know why this struck me so. I mean, I've never gone to any of these Mayan places or these Aztec places or anything like that, but I know it's a big tourist thing. There are millions of dollars that are flooding into these areas because people want to go visit these extraordinary architectural wonders of, stone pyramids and such. But I just thought, I know that there are people who go to Auschwitz, for example, but it's not the same as people who go to see the Mayan ruins. It's not a thing you do for fun. It's not, it is something that you do to remember. And there's a sense of somberness about it. And I'm wondering if this guy's report is basically trying to take that into account and go, look, don't stop doing your tourism here just because these guys were slaughtering little boys as sacrifice to their gods or for whatever purpose. And just the idea, two things, Bill. Number one, we cannot judge them from our current perspective. And then number two, and let's see if you agree with this, our current perspective is that killing children is wrong.
Well, first of all, let's just start with the most obvious thing that came out of this. It's interesting to me that this guy says that we cannot judge them when this guy and everybody he knows does nothing but judge Western society by the standards of today. He is basically saying you need to carve out a space for what I've discovered here, but we're going to continue to judge Western civilization, white supremacists, all the rest of the stuff that he and his colleagues all believe in, because that's exactly what modern science is completely riddled with. But let's just get down to the nuts and bolts here. This is not, he didn't say this because he's concerned about tourism dropping off in places like Tikal and Chichen Itza, which are probably the two main Mayan sites. He is putting this out there because he understands that this is a repugnant practice, and it looks bad upon the authentic people of color who were so badly brutalized by the evil white supremacists who came in and decimated their culture. Now, I'm just going to shift gears a little bit because I don't think it's relevant to the discussion. And rather than talking about the Mayans, I'm going to talk about the Aztecs. The Aztecs were without question, I'm a historian, the Aztecs were without question the worst culture that has ever existed on this earth. In a pre-industrial era, the Aztecs would sacrifice 80,000 people in 4 days. And they did this by marching them up a pyramid, lying them back against a stone pillar, taking an obsidian knife, cutting out their living heart, holding it up to their god, and then kicking the body down this very steep pyramid where their skin would be flayed off, and then some of their priests would run around and wear the skin. That's not fiction. I didn't make that up. I didn't create the Aztec culture. The Aztec culture created itself. They believed that it took blood for the sun to rise every day, and if that blood god was not appeased, then there you go. So for this guy to say, no, death was different then, you see, they didn't look at death the same way we did. My response to that would be, of the 80,000 slaves who were painted blue, marched up to the top of those pyramids, had their living hearts cut out to sacrifice to your gods, how many of them would walk away if they had the chance? Because I'm guessing all of them, right? I'm guessing every single one of them. Those Mesoamerican civilizations, the Incas in South America were not as prone to this, not nearly. But the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Toltecs and the rest of them were civilizations that were mini empires and would go out into the native tribes that surrounded them, basically just farmers and hunter-gatherers, and on a regular basis go on these raiding parties where they would round up innocent people who were out there gathering food, take them back to their cities and sacrifice them to their blood gods, to the cheers of everybody, I might add. And if you want to understand what this looks like, Scott, if you want to understand what this kind of culture actually looks like, you have to look very hard to find an extremely important and not just important, a terrific movie made by a major Hollywood director that has been removed specifically because it showed what these Mesoamerican cultures are and were. And that film is called Apocalypto, directed by Mel Gibson.
Yeah.
If you see Apocalypto, you will understand what these civilizations were. And the reason he's issuing this, Scott, is because the narrative is that these brown people of color, these indigenous people who can't be anything other than noble people who don't contribute to our climate footprint in any way, when you find out what those people actually did as part of their civilization, all of a sudden, as Steve pointed out, this business of the conquistadors coming with the word of Christ and so on is not as horrific as what was there before, to put it in the mildest possible terms. So to say, yes, we found 500 years of them murdering their own children, but we shouldn't judge them by our modern standards. My response to him would be to say, well, I'm glad to hear you say that. Perhaps you won't judge slavery by our modern standards, or any of the other ills of Western civilization that you continue to bring up and harp upon. These things, look, history is real. These things actually happened. And just to close this up, my wife has a tendency which is very good for her, I admire it very much, and is needed for me, to constantly remind me to see both sides of the story. But she will often talk about war as just saying two people fighting over something. I said, well, honey, yes, that is true. But in the case of World War II, it was two people arguing and fighting about whether or not you're going to put people into concrete bunkers and gas them to death. So it's not a morally neutral game that we're just some giant misunderstanding here. If you believe that murder is wrong, then you do have a side that is murdering people and a side that's not murdering people. And if you can't see the difference between those two things, I'm not talking to my wife now, I'm talking about this clown, then there's something wrong with you.
It's interesting, Bill, because he starts off the quote in the present tense. But what we have to bear in mind is that death is a completely different concept for Mesoamerican cultures. Death is not seen as a bad thing. So he starts off in the present tense. Now, maybe he's using some kind of weird historical present tense, but then he goes on to say, of course, under our perspective, it's wrong. And I take issue with that. I don't know whose perspective he's talking about, but I don't think everybody thinks it's wrong to murder babies. I mean, clearly it's being practiced at scale in the United States of America and other Western nations, as well as in other parts of the world. So I don't know what perspective he's taken to say that it's wrong. Maybe it's wrong when the child is 3 or 6 years old, but it's not wrong at some point, is it? And so first of all, I don't know where he even gets that. But then to go on to say we can't judge what they did under our modern point of view. Well, that's all historical revisionists do these days, as you pointed out, is to judge the past under current standards. However, there's a difference between current standards and enduring principles. And frankly, God's law. And thou shalt not kill was in effect back then as it is now. And so there was never a time in history, in any culture, where any mother said with joy, here, take my 3-year-old boy and slaughter him on the pyramid, because it's the right thing to do. Nobody thought that way. And if these so-called Mesoamerican cultures thought it was the right thing to do, well, then the people with the obsidian knife in their hand or whatever they were using as an instrument of slaughter should have taken it to their own throats and done it to themselves first. Because if death is completely different in Mesoamerican culture and not a bad thing, then why weren't the people who believed that fervently just offing themselves instead of slaughtering little boys? Anyway, this is, it's too late to give a hard time to the Mayans. They're all gone. But it's not too late to go after people, not just Rodrigo Barquera from the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, but anybody who is looking at something and saying, well, we don't want to be too self-righteous here. It's still wrong. It was wrong. It will always be wrong to do that. And I can't imagine going on a fun-filled vacation to a place where one might uncover a cistern with 100 little boy corpses in it that were slaughtered by adults because their Mesoamerican culture compelled them to do it and they thought it was the right thing to do. The worst sorts of heinous crimes in history have been done by people who allegedly claimed that allegedly it was the right thing to do. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.